There is something about the ocean at dusk, the way the light dissolves into it, slow and amber, the way the horizon seems not like an ending but like a question. For centuries, men looked out at that horizon and asked what lay beyond it. Most of them stayed on shore. A few of them climbed aboard a ship, and one of them, aboard one very particular ship, sailed until he had circled the entire world. Her name was the Golden Hind. She was not the largest vessel of her age. She was not the most heavily armed, nor the most elaborately decorated, nor the most formally celebrated by any navy or crown. And yet, of all the ships that crossed the waters of the 16th century, an era so rich in seafaring ambition, it almost bends the imagination. She is perhaps the one that history has held closest, because the Golden Hind did not simply sail. She endured, she overcame. She slipped through straits no English ship had ever entered, crept along coastlines that no Englishman had ever seen, and returned home carrying more treasure than most men of her time could have counted in a lifetime. She was a galleon, or rather, a race-built galleon, which is an important distinction. Where older ship designs sat heavy and high in the water, their towering fore and aft castles catching the wind like great wooden sails of their own, the race-built galleon had been trimmed down, stripped of much of that excess height, and rendered sleeker, faster, and far more responsive to her helm. She was built to move, built to chase, and, when necessary, built to vanish. The Golden Hind measured roughly 100 feet from bow to stern. Some estimates place her slightly shorter, closer to 70 feet at the keel, and her beam, the width of her, ran to perhaps 20 feet. She displaced somewhere between 150 tons, depending on which historical accounting one follows. By modern standards, she was intimate, she was compact, she might look, at first glance, almost modest. But look again. She carried 18 guns, a formidable broadside for a vessel of her size, and she was rigged with 3 masts, each bearing a combination of square sails and lateen sails that gave her flexibility across a wide range of wind conditions. In a following wind, she could run fast and full. Into a headwind, she could work her angles and still make progress. She was, in the language of her era, a well-found ship, meaning everything about her had been chosen and fitted with care. Her crew, at the outset of her great voyage, numbered around 160 men. By the time she came home, that number would be considerably smaller. The ocean has always been particular about who it returns. The man who commanded her was Francis Drake, privateer, navigator, naval commander, and, depending entirely on whose history you are reading, either a hero of extraordinary courage or a pirate of extraordinary nerve. Possibly both. The Spanish called him El Drac, and they called him something else as well. They called him the Dragon. They did not mean it kindly, but there is no arguing with the fact that he understood the sea in a way that few men of any century have. Under his hand, the Golden Hind was not merely a vessel. She was an extension of his will. Their voyage together began in 1577, when Drake departed Plymouth, England, with a small fleet of 5 ships under the commission, though a quietly deniable one, of Queen Elizabeth I first. The stated purpose was trade and exploration. The true purpose was rather more complicated, as purposes so often are in that particular era of history. What followed was a circumnavigation of the globe, the second in human history, and the first ever completed by the captain who began it. Magellan had started such a voyage before Drake. He had not lived to finish it. Drake did. He sailed west and south, slipped through the treacherous passage at the southern tip of South America that now bears the name of Magellan, crossed the vast and almost incomprehensible Pacific, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and sailed back north and home. He did it in roughly 3 years. He did it with 1 ship, for the others had been lost, turned back, or deliberately scuttled along the way. And that one ship, by the time it nosed back into Plymouth Sound in September of 1580, was laden with plundered Spanish silver, spices from the Moluccas, and the extraordinary particular weight of history. Queen Elizabeth came aboard the Golden Hind the following spring at Deptford on the Thames. She knighted Francis Drake on her deck. In the segments that follow, we will take our time with all of it. The ship herself, the man who sailed her, the voyage that made them both immortal. We will walk the narrow world of her lower decks, feel the swell beneath her keel, and stand alongside her crew in moments of terror, wonder, and quiet perseverance. There is no need to rush. The story has been waiting 400 years. It can wait a little longer while we settle in. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine her, not as an illustration in a history book, those flat, tidy renderings with their clean lines and their convenient cross-sections. Imagine her as she actually was. Imagine standing on a dock in Plymouth in the year 1577, the air carrying that particular mixture of salt and timber and tar that has always belonged to working harbours, and watching her sit in the water before you. She moves gently, even at rest, a slow, patient rocking, as if she is already dreaming of open sea. Her hull is dark, sealed with pitch against the relentless ambitions of seawater. Her three masts rise against the grey English sky like the bare branches of winter trees, and the rigging between them, the web of rope and line and tackle that will soon become a sailor's entire universe, hums faintly in the harbour wind. She is not quite what you expected. She is smaller than the great warships of the age, smaller than the enormous Spanish galleons that are, at this very moment, ferrying the wealth of the New World across the Atlantic in regular, heavily guarded convoys. She does not possess the brute mass of those vessels. She does not need to, because the Golden Hind was not designed to be the biggest thing on the water. She was designed to be the most effective thing on the water. And those are very different ambitions, arriving at very different results. She had begun her life under a different name. Before she became the Golden Hind, she was christened the Pelican, a name that Drake changed mid-voyage somewhere in the Pacific in honor of Sir Christopher Hatton, one of his principal patrons, whose family crest featured a golden hind, that is to say, a female deer of reddish gold. It was a political gesture as much as a sentimental one, the renaming of a ship being a serious matter in any age, but it was also, perhaps, a recognition that this vessel had already become something more than her original name implied. She had passed through the Strait of Magellan by that point. She had survived storms of a ferocity that had broken the other ships of Drake's fleet entirely. She had earned something. A new name felt appropriate. But let us return to her construction, because it tells us a great deal about the world that built her. The 16th century was a period of rapid and restless evolution in ship design. For centuries, European vessels had been built around a principle of dominance through mass, tall, imposing structures whose very height conveyed authority and whose sheer displacement made them difficult to sink. These were ships built to intimidate as much as to sail, and in the relatively enclosed waters of the Mediterranean, or in the short, violent naval engagements common to northern European coastal warfare, that approach had served well enough. But the age of oceanic exploration demanded something different. It demanded endurance over intimidation. It demanded the ability to sail for weeks and months without a friendly port, to manage extreme weather in open water, to cover enormous distances on limited stores, and to remain responsive and controllable in the kind of conditions that simply do not occur in coastal sailing. The race-built design that shaped the Golden Hind was, in many respects, England's answer to those demands. English shipwrights of the mid to late 16th century, men like Matthew Baker, who is often credited with refining the design principles that would define English naval architecture for generations, had begun to think differently about the relationship between a ship's hull and the water it moved through. Rather than sitting above the water, They wanted a ship that moved through it. Lower superstructures, longer, more streamlined hulls relative to their beam, a lower center of gravity that improved stability in heavy seas, sharper entry at the bow to reduce resistance. These were not merely aesthetic changes. They were engineering decisions with profound consequences for what a ship could do and where it could go. The Golden Hind embodied this thinking. Her forecastle, the raised platform at the bow, was present but modest, reduced considerably from the towering structures that characterized earlier vessel types. Her stern castle, similarly, was trimmed and functional rather than palatial. This restraint in height meant that the wind had less of her to push against when it came from an unfavorable direction, and it meant that her handling in rough weather was dramatically improved. A high-sided ship in a beam sea. A sea running across the vessel at 90 degrees is a miserable and dangerous thing. It catches the wind, it rolls violently, it is difficult to steer and exhausting to sail. The Golden Hind, lower and sleeker, was comparatively manageable. Comparatively, it must be said. The Atlantic and the Pacific are not in the business of making anything easy. Her keel, the long central structural spine running the length of her bottom, would have been fashioned from English oak, as would the primary frames that curved upward from it, like the ribs of some great sea creature. Oak was the shipbuilding timber of England, prized for its density, its hardness, and its remarkable resistance to the particular cruelties that seawater visits upon wood. A well-built oak hull, properly maintained, could last decades. The planking over those frames, the outer skin of the ship, would have been fastened with wooden treenails or treenails, wooden pegs driven through plank and frame alike, and then wedged at both ends so that they swelled with moisture and locked themselves into position. Iron fastenings were also used, though iron had its own problems in salt water, being prone to corrosion in ways that were imperfectly understood at the time, but very practically experienced by anyone who had seen an old iron bolt weep rust streaks down a ship's side. The bottom of the hull, the portion below the waterline, presented one of the great perpetual challenges of wooden ship construction. The sea is not passive. It works against a hull in two ways simultaneously, through the physical force of waves and currents, and through the biological ambitions of marine organisms. Chief among the latter was the shipworm, not actually a worm, but a bivalve mollusk of the genus Pterido, a creature of extraordinary destructive capability that burrows into submerged timber and, given sufficient time, can reduce a sound plank to something resembling a honeycomb. The standard countermeasure of the era was to sheathe the underwater hull in a sacrificial layer of softer wood, often elm, over which a mixture of tar, animal fat, and sometimes powdered materials was applied to discourage the borers and retard the growth of weed and barnacles, which, while they did not destroy the wood, could add considerable drag and slow the ship appreciably. Drake was meticulous about the maintenance of his hull. At various points during the circumnavigation, he ordered the ship careened, hauled over onto her side in a sheltered bay so that her bottom could be inspected, scraped, and recaulked. This was laborious, time-consuming work that required the unloading of a significant portion of the ship's stores and guns to reduce her weight sufficiently, and it left the ship temporarily vulnerable in a way that made every experienced sailor deeply uncomfortable. But it was necessary. A neglected hull was a slow hull, and a slow hull, in the circumstances that Drake was navigating, circumstances that frequently involved the pursuit of Spanish treasure ships, or the urgent desire to be very far away from whatever Spanish warships might be arriving, was a liability that could not be afforded. Her rig, too, deserves attention. The Golden Hind carried 3 masts, the foremast and mainmast, each bearing large square sails, and the mizzenmast at the stern, which carried a lateen sail, a triangular sail set on a long yard angled across the mast. This combination was characteristic of the galleon type, and gave the ship a versatility that purely square-rigged vessels lacked. Square sails were magnificent downwind, catching great bellying quantities of following breeze and driving the ship forward with considerable force. But they were inefficient when the wind came from ahead or even from the side, and the lateen on the mizzen, together with careful management of the other sails, allowed the ship to sail at angles to the wind that would have been impossible on a simpler rig. Above the main square sails, the Golden Hind almost certainly carried topsails, and possibly topgallants above those. Smaller sails set on upper extensions of the masts that could be deployed in lighter winds or when extra speed was urgently desired. The management of all these sails, in varying combinations across changing wind and sea conditions, was a skilled and continuous task that occupied her crew day and night without interruption. There was no such thing as a sailing ship that looked after herself. She required constant attention, constant reading of the wind and sea, constant trimming and adjustment, constant readiness to reduce sail quickly when the weather threatened to become more than the rig could safely carry. And so the men who sailed her, the ones who went aloft in the dark and the rain to reef a topsail while the ship pitched and rolled beneath them, the ones who worked the pumps in the low, stinking bilges to keep the inevitable seepage from accumulating into something dangerous, the ones who manned the guns and coiled the ropes and spliced the lines and kept the whole intricate, interdependent system of wood and rope and canvas functioning across 3 years and 40,000 miles of ocean. They were, in their own way, as remarkable as the ship herself, but they will have their moment in the story. For now, let the ship rest in the harbor a little longer. Let the rigging hum. Let the tide come in around her hull, patient and dark and full of everything the sea has always known and never told. She is almost ready to sail. There is a particular kind of man that certain eras seem almost to require, as though history, sensing what is coming, reaches into the available human material and selects accordingly. The 16th century required navigators. It required men who could hold a course across an ocean that had no roads, no signposts, and no mercy, and who could do so not merely with competence, but with a quality that sits somewhere between vision and audacity, and is sometimes, in quieter moments, indistinguishable from recklessness. It required men who were comfortable with uncertainty in a way that most human beings, in any century, fundamentally, are not. It found Francis Drake. He was born sometime around 1540. The exact year is uncertain, which is itself a small window into the world that made him. The precise recording of birth dates was a privilege that attached itself to rank and station, and Drake was born into neither. He came into the world in Tavistock, in Devon, the eldest son of Edmund Drake, a farmer, and lay preacher of modest means and strong Protestant conviction. Devon was a county that faced the sea. Its harbours and fishing villages and coastal trade routes had been shaping the temperament of its people for generations, and something of that orientation, that habitual westward looking, that familiarity with water as a fact of daily life, rather than a distant abstraction, ran through Francis Drake from the beginning. His childhood was not comfortable. When he was still young, his family left Devon for Kent, where they settled in difficult circumstances, reportedly living at one point in an old hulk, a decommissioned ship's hull, moored in the River Medway. Whether this origin story is precisely true in every detail matters less than what it suggests. That Francis Drake grew up close to ships, close to water, and close to the particular combination of physical hardship and maritime possibility that would define the rest of his life. He went to sea young. His early years as a mariner were spent in the coasting trade, the unglamorous but essential business of moving goods along England's shores and across the short sea routes to the near continent. He learned navigation not from books, though he would come to books later, and he would take them with him on the circumnavigation, but from the accumulated practical wisdom of men who had been doing it their whole lives. He learned to read the sky and the sea simultaneously. He learned to feel a ship's response beneath his feet as a kind of language. He learned that the ocean rewarded attention and punished inattention with a consistency that no human institution could quite match. His connection to the wider world of oceanic exploration came through his family, the Hawkins family of Plymouth. One of the great seafaring dynasties of Elizabethan England, were relatives by marriage, and it was with John Hawkins that Drake made his first Atlantic voyages in the 1560s, participating in the English slave trade that moved human beings from West Africa to the Spanish colonies of the Caribbean. These were voyages of considerable brutality, a fact that history cannot and should not soften. And they ended badly. In 1568, at the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua, a Spanish fleet trapped the English vessels in harbor and attacked without warning, destroying several of Drake's ships and killing many of his men. Drake himself escaped, barely, aboard a vessel so overloaded with survivors that accounts suggest he was eventually forced to put men ashore on the Mexican coast rather than watch them drown collectively in the overcrowded ship. He never forgot San Juan de Ulua. He never forgave it. What followed in the years between that ambush and the circumnavigation was a sustained and increasingly audacious campaign of reprisal against Spanish interests in the Americas. Raids on the treasure route across the Isthmus of Panama, attacks on coastal settlements, the interception of silver mule trains making their way through the jungle toward the Pacific coast. Drake operated in these years as a privateer, which is a word that sits in a carefully maintained legal gray area between naval commander and pirate. A privateer held a commission from his sovereign, or claimed to, which authorized him to prey upon the shipping and possessions of enemy or rival nations. In practice, the line between privateering and piracy was drawn largely by who was doing the drawing, and the Spanish, who were losing the silver, drew it firmly on the piracy side. But Drake was building something in these years beyond a reputation and a personal fortune. He was building knowledge. Every voyage taught him more about the Atlantic, about the Spanish colonial system, about its strengths and, more crucially, its vulnerabilities. He was learning where the wealth was, how it moved, how it was guarded, and where it was not guarded at all. He was learning, in the most expensive and dangerous school available, exactly what the Spanish Empire looked like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who wanted to get inside it. By the time he stood before Queen Elizabeth I and presented his plan for the voyage that would become the circumnavigation, he was not a young adventurer with a dream and insufficient experience. He was a seasoned mariner in his late 30s, with more practical knowledge of Atlantic navigation and Spanish colonial vulnerabilities than almost anyone alive. He was also a man of compelling personal force. Contemporary accounts describe him as of medium height and build, stocky, some say, with a reddish beard and an expression that managed to combine confidence with a particular quality of watchful intelligence. He was charming when it served him, and he was not charming when it did not. He had the gift of inspiring loyalty in the men who sailed with him, which was not a minor gift, because men who sailed in small wooden ships across unknown oceans in the 16th century had ample opportunity to reconsider their loyalty, and needed a compelling reason not to. He also had, it must be said, a ruthlessness that he did not trouble to conceal. During the circumnavigation itself, in a moment that has been debated by historians ever since, Drake had his second-in-command, Thomas Doughty, tried for mutiny and treason and executed on the shores of Patagonia at a place now called Port Saint Julian. The evidence against Doughty was disputed at the time and has been disputed ever since. What is not disputed is that Drake, faced with the possibility of dissent and division in his small fleet at the very moment when absolute unity of purpose was most essential, they were about to attempt the Strait of Magellan, which had been transited only once before, by Magellan himself, and which had a reputation that justified the deepest apprehension, chose to make an example that could not be misunderstood. Doughty was beheaded. The fleet sailed south. There was no further significant descent. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one, and it belongs to any honest portrait of the man. What Drake possessed, beyond his navigational skill and his strategic intelligence and his force of personality, was something that is perhaps best described as an extraordinary tolerance for the unknown. Most people, in any age, prefer to operate within the boundaries of what is mapped, what is charted, understood, and predictable. Drake operated most confidently, it seems, at precisely the point where the map ran out. In the Pacific, sailing north along the coast of South America after his raids on Spanish ports had made remaining in those waters acutely dangerous, he entered seas that no English ship had ever crossed. He did not know what was ahead of him. He did not know how wide the ocean was exactly. He did not know what he would find, or whether he would find anything. He sailed anyway. That combination, the careful, accumulated practical knowledge on one hand, and the willingness to step beyond it entirely on the other, is what made him uniquely suited to the Golden Hind and uniquely suited to the voyage they undertook together. The ship gave him the capability. He provided the will to use it at the edges of the known world. There is a detail, small but quietly resonant, that deserves mention before we leave this portrait of the man. When Drake returned to Plymouth in September of 1580, having been gone nearly 3 years, having sailed 40,000 miles, and lost the majority of his crew to disease, storm, and the ordinary merciless arithmetic of oceanic voyaging, the first thing he reportedly asked someone on shore was whether the Queen was still alive. Not whether he was celebrated, not whether his treasure was safe, whether the Queen was still alive. It is the question of a man who understood with absolute clarity that everything he had done and everything he had brought home existed within a political world that could turn on him entirely if the wrong person now sat on the English throne. It is the question of a man who had never, not for a single day of that extraordinary voyage, stopped thinking. Elizabeth was alive. She was, by all accounts, delighted. Drake came home to a world that was not quite sure what to do with him, which is, perhaps, the natural resting place for a man who had spent 3 years doing things the world had not previously believed possible, but the world would find a use for him. It always does, for men like that. And the Golden Hind, his ship, his instrument, his home for 3 years across the curve of the entire earth, would find her own kind of immortality, in a way that neither of them could have fully anticipated on that autumn morning when she nosed into Plymouth Sound, low in the water, salt-stained, and carrying everything. She was not done yet. Neither was he. Plymouth, in the winter of 1577, was a town that knew how to say goodbye to ships. It had been doing it long enough. The harbour had watched vessels leave on tides that never brought them back, had listened to the particular silence that settles over a port town after a fleet has gone, that absence of creaking timber and shouted orders that is somehow louder than the sounds it replaces. The people of Plymouth understood, in the practical, unsentimental way of those who live beside the sea, that a ship departing for distant waters was a possibility as much as a certainty. A possibility of return, a possibility of wealth, a possibility of news from places so remote they existed, for most people, only as rumors and conjecture. On the 13th of December, 1577, Francis Drake led 5 ships out of Plymouth Sound and turned them south. The fleet he commanded was modest in size but carefully assembled. Alongside the Pelican, the ship that would become the Golden Hind, sailed the Elizabeth, of 80 tons, commanded by John Winter, the Marigold, a bark of 30 tons, the Swan, a flyboat carrying stores, and the Christopher, a small pinnace. Together they carried something in the region of 160 to 170 men, a number that sounds substantial until one begins to imagine all of them living, eating, sleeping, working, and sickening within the combined space of 5 small wooden vessels on an ocean that was about to get considerably larger. The official purpose of the voyage, as stated in the documents that existed for the convenience of anyone who might ask awkward questions, was trade and exploration along the coast of Alexandria. This was not a serious claim. It was a diplomatic fiction, and a thin one, maintained primarily to give Queen Elizabeth sufficient distance from whatever Drake was about to do that she could, if the political situation required it, express surprise and mild disapproval. What Drake was actually going to do: raid Spanish possessions, disrupt the flow of silver from the Americas, and demonstrate that the Pacific Ocean was not, as Spain had long assumed, a private Spanish lake, was understood by everyone in that harbor who needed to understand it. The early stages of the voyage were not auspicious. Storms scattered the fleet almost immediately after departure, driving the ships back toward the English coast and forcing Drake to reassemble his command at Falmouth before attempting the crossing to Morocco again. It was the kind of beginning that might have discouraged a less determined commander, or perhaps more accurately, that might have been interpreted by a more superstitious one as an indication of divine opinion on the enterprise. Drake interpreted it as weather. He gathered his ships, checked his stores, and sailed again. The fleet moved south along the African coast, pausing to take on water and provisions and, at various points, to capture Portuguese and Spanish vessels whose stores and, in one notable case, whose pilot would prove useful for the voyage ahead. The acquisition of a good pilot, a man with practical navigational knowledge of the waters you intended to cross, was considered entirely legitimate practice in this era, and the Portuguese pilot Nuno da Silva, taken from a captured vessel off the Cape Verde Islands, would sail with Drake for more than a year, contributing his considerable knowledge of Atlantic navigation and leaving behind, eventually, journals that remain among the more useful primary sources for reconstructing the voyage. By the time they reached the coast of South America, the fleet had already experienced the first serious internal fractures. The tension between Drake and Thomas Doughty, that tension which would end so definitively on the Patagonian shore, had been building throughout the Atlantic crossing, fed by questions of authority, accusations of sorcery and sabotage, and the particular combustibility that attaches to men of strong personality confined together in small spaces for extended periods. When Drake called his halt at Port St. Julian in June of 1578, the same harbor where Magellan himself had wintered nearly 60 years before, and where Magellan too had been forced to deal with a mutiny among his officers, the symmetry was not lost on those who knew their history. Doughty was tried, convicted, and executed. Drake then did something that is, when one considers it carefully, quite remarkable. He gathered his entire company together, officers and common sailors alike, and he spoke to them. He explained what they were undertaking. He explained what he needed from them. He reduced the fleet from 5 ships to 3, scuttling the Christopher and the Swan, to consolidate men and stores into vessels that could be properly crewed, and he prepared to take those 3 ships into the most dangerous stretch of water in the known world. The Strait of Magellan is approximately 350 miles long. It winds between the southern tip of mainland South America and the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego, a landscape of glaciers and grey rock and screaming wind that has the quality of a place that was never intended for human beings and has never quite reconciled itself to their occasional presence. The currents within the strait run fast and unpredictable. The weather changes without warning or apology. The channels are narrow enough, in places, that the margin between navigating successfully and piling onto a rock is measured in yards rather than miles. Magellan had taken 38 days to work his way through. Drake took 16. 16 days, in wooden ships, with 16th century navigation instruments, against winds that could change direction faster than a sail could be trimmed. It remains, when one stops to consider it properly, a staggering piece of seamanship. But the Pacific, when they finally entered it, offered no reward for their effort. Almost immediately, a storm of exceptional violence, lasting, by Drake's own account, more than 50 days, drove the fleet south and east, scattering the ships and very nearly destroying them entirely. The Marigold was lost with all hands. The Elizabeth, badly damaged, and her crew reportedly convinced that Drake himself had perished, turned back through the strait and eventually made her way home to England. Drake, alone now on the Pelican, the ship he would shortly rename the Golden Hind, was driven so far south that he found himself in waters below the tip of Tierra del Fuego and made the remarkable geographic discovery that the two great oceans met there freely, that the land did not continue indefinitely southward, as most geographers had assumed, that there was open water between South America and whatever land, if any, lay at the pole. He had discovered, in the extremity of survival, something that would eventually bear his name, the Drake Passage. When the storm finally released him and he was able to work his way north along the Pacific coast of South America, Drake was commanding a single ship with a reduced crew in an ocean that no English vessel had ever crossed, along a coastline that was entirely Spanish territory, and entirely, his presence was absolutely, lethally unwelcome. He proceeded to raid it with extraordinary calm. The Spanish ports and settlements along the Pacific coast of South America had never needed to defend themselves seriously. The Pacific was theirs. They knew it, and the knowledge had made them, in certain respects, comfortable in a way that comfort should never make a soldier or a sailor. Their treasure was moved along the coast in ships that carried it without particular haste and without particularly heavy armament, because there had never been any reason to hurry or to arm. The idea that an English privateer might appear on their ocean was, until Drake appeared on their ocean, essentially unthinkable. Drake took full advantage of their unpreparedness. At Valparaiso, he entered the harbor and took a vessel laden with Chilean gold before the inhabitants had fully processed what was happening. Moving north, he raided coastal settlements and captured supply ships, gathering intelligence from each about what lay ahead, and then came the prize that would define the entire voyage. The treasure ship Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, known to its crew by the less reverent nickname Cacafuego, which translates into English in a way that this particular documentary will leave to the listener's imagination. The Cacafuego was the great Pacific treasure galleon, the richest single vessel on the entire ocean. Drake chased her for several days, closing the distance slowly and carefully, using improvised sea anchors trailed behind his ship to disguise his speed and prevent the Cacafuego's crew from realizing they were being overhauled until it was too late to run. When he finally drew alongside her, in late February of 1579, the engagement was almost disappointingly brief. The Cacafuego was not equipped for a fight with a determined, well-armed privateer. She surrendered, and her cargo, 13 chests of silver coins, 80 pounds of gold, 26 tons of uncoined silver, and a quantity of jewels and precious stones, was transferred methodically and without particular drama into the hold of the Golden Hind. Drake then continued north, probing the coast of what is now California and Oregon, possibly looking for the fabled Northwest Passage that might offer a route home across the top of North America, and eventually making landfall at a bay north of present-day San Francisco, where he spent 5 weeks careening the ship, repairing her, and receiving, by all accounts, a remarkable welcome from the indigenous people of the region. He claimed the land for England, called it Nova Albion, and erected a brass plate bearing the Queen's name. The plate, whether genuine or a later fabrication, has passed into the mythology of that California coastline as a ghost of a different possible history, one in which England, rather than Spain, settled the Pacific shore. Then he turned west, into the largest ocean on Earth. With a single ship, a reduced crew, and the accumulated weight of enough Spanish silver to alter the economic calculations of an entire nation, The Pacific received him in its customary silence. The known world was behind him now. Everything ahead was somewhere else entirely. There is a particular quality to silence that only the open ocean provides, not the absence of sound. The sea is never truly silent, not with the constant conversation of water against hull, the low percussion of wind in rigging, the rhythmic complaint of timber under load. But there is a silence beneath all of that, a silence of scale that settles over a ship when the last visible landmass has dropped below the horizon and there is nothing in any direction but water and sky and the slow turning of the stars overhead. It is a silence that makes a man aware, in a way that no amount of intellectual understanding can fully prepare him for, of exactly how small he is and exactly how large everything else is. Francis Drake sailed into that silence in the summer of 1579, and he did not see land again for 68 days. 68 days on the open Pacific in the Golden Hind, with somewhere between 60 and 80 men. The precise number is uncertain, as the records from this portion of the voyage are less complete than those from the Atlantic crossing, and a hold so weighted with Spanish silver that the ship rode lower in the water than her designer had ever intended. The treasure that had seemed, in the moment of its capture, like unambiguous triumph, now presented a practical problem of the first order. The Golden Hind was overloaded. She was sluggish in the water, slower to respond to her helm, less able to lift her bow over the long Pacific swells that rolled toward her in steady, enormous procession from the west. Drake had, at various points during the northward run along the South American coast, thrown ballast overboard to make room for silver. He had replaced weight with weight, and the weight he had chosen was considerably more valuable, but considerably less useful for the purposes of keeping a ship properly balanced and properly safe. The Pacific crossing was not, by the standards of what had come before, dramatically eventful. No great storms, no Spanish warships materializing from the horizon, no mutinies, no navigational catastrophes, no moments of the kind of acute crisis that makes for vivid retelling. What it was, instead, was something perhaps more quietly demanding. A sustained test of endurance, routine, and the particular psychological resilience required to function normally when normality itself has been suspended indefinitely. The men of the Golden Hind lived during those 68 days in a world bounded entirely by the ship's dimensions. Their universe was 100 feet of timber and rope and canvas, populated by 60 to 80 people who knew each other's habits, temperaments, and personal histories with an intimacy that most people never achieve with anyone. They slept in watches, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, a rhythm that fractures sleep so thoroughly that a kind of permanent mild exhaustion becomes the baseline condition of consciousness. They ate salt meat and hard biscuit, and whatever could be preserved or caught. They worked the ship continuously, trimming sails, checking rigging, manning the pumps, splicing the inevitable broken lines that a ship produces in steady, inexorable quantity simply by being used. They prayed, because the 16th century was an age in which the relationship between spiritual observance and physical survival was understood to be direct and literal, and they waited, in the patient, suspended way that sailors learn or break under the learning, for land. It appeared, eventually, as land always does. First as a thickening of the horizon, a darkness that might be cloud but sits too still, and then, slowly, unmistakably, as the green and mountainous reality of the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, the destination that had drawn Magellan westward 60 years before, the source of the cloves and nutmeg and mace that European markets consumed with an appetite that seems, from our comfortable distance, almost incomprehensible, but which made perfect sense in an era before refrigeration, when the ability to preserve and flavor food was not a culinary luxury, but a practical necessity of survival through winter. Drake arrived at the island of Ternate in November of 1579, and what he found there was both practically useful and historically significant. The Sultan of Ternate, Bab, sometimes rendered Babullah in the historical accounts, was a man who had his own complicated and unhappy relationship with European colonial ambition. Having spent years fighting to reduce Portuguese influence in his islands, the arrival of an English captain laden with silver and apparently unaffiliated with Portugal or Spain was therefore not unwelcome. Drake and the Sultan established what the accounts describe as a warm and mutually respectful relationship, and the Golden Hind took on a substantial cargo of cloves, 6 tons by some accounts. That would add considerably to the commercial value of what she carried home. The island of Ternate itself, and the brief weeks Drake spent in its waters, represent one of the more genuinely peaceful interludes in a voyage that had been characterized, for much of its duration, by tension and danger, and the constant vigilance of a man operating in hostile territory. There was trade, there was diplomacy of a reasonably genuine kind. There were, by the accounts of those on board, moments of actual rest and actual wonder. The unfamiliar landscape of tropical islands seen by English eyes for the first time. The extraordinary biological richness of a part of the world that Europe had only previously encountered at the spice markets, translated into powder and dried bark, stripped of everything that made it alive. But the ocean is not a place that allows too long a rest, and Drake knew it. The Golden Hind was still a very long way from home. She departed the Moluccas and began working her way southwest through the Indonesian archipelago, a navigation of exceptional complexity, through island-dotted waters where the charts, such as they were unreliable, and the consequences of a navigational error were immediate and severe. The consequences arrived in January of 1580. In the darkness of a January night, moving through the Celebes Sea, the Golden Hind struck a reef. She struck it hard enough and held on it firmly enough that the immediate assumption of everyone aboard was that she was lost. The ship was fast on the coral, heeled over. The water around her churned white by the swell that pushed her further onto the obstruction with each passing wave. Drake ordered the pumps manned and found, to what must have been acute relief, that she was not making serious water. The hull had not been breached, or not breached badly, but she could not be worked free. The sails were useless, there was no room to maneuver. The kedge anchor was deployed. A smaller anchor carried specifically for this kind of emergency, rowed out in the ship's boat, and dropped at a distance so that the crew could haul on the anchor cable and try to drag the ship off the obstruction. But the coral held. Drake did what he always did in crisis. He thought. He ordered the guns moved. In a ship already dangerously overloaded with Spanish silver, the iron guns represented significant weight concentrated in specific locations, and shifting them altered the ship's trim, the angle at which she sat in the water. He ordered stores moved. He ordered, with what must have been genuine pain even for a practical man, that a portion of the cloves taken on at Ternate be thrown overboard. Several tons of spice went into the Celebes Sea that night. A commercial loss of real significance that Drake accepted without apparent hesitation, because the alternative was losing everything. And then, in the way that the sea sometimes, unpredictably, relents, the wind shifted. The swell changed its angle slightly. The Golden Hind, lightened and repositioned, moved. Slowly at first, then with gathering purpose. She slid back off the coral and into navigable water. The pumps confirmed what the crew desperately needed to hear. She was sound. She was bruised, shaken, and lighter than she had been, but she was floating freely in the deep water, and her hull was holding. Drake set the watches, checked the compass, and sailed on. The route home from the Indonesian archipelago took the Golden Hind southwest across the Indian Ocean, following the same great arc that the Portuguese had established as the reliable path between Asia and Europe, south and west. until the prevailing winds of the southern Indian Ocean could be caught, then northwest, up the African coast and eventually around the Cape of Good Hope. It was a long route, and it added thousands of miles to a voyage that was already the longest a single English captain had ever undertaken. But it was a known route, or more nearly known than anything Drake had sailed in the Pacific. And there is something to be said, after months of genuinely uncharted water, for sailing a course that someone has sailed before. The Cape of Good Hope was rounded in June of 5080. The Atlantic opened before them. In the context of what they had already crossed, the Atlantic, the ocean that had seemed so vast and so threatening when they had set out from Plymouth 2.5 years before, must have felt almost familiar, almost welcoming. They knew this water. They had crossed it before. The stars above it were the right ones. The trade winds behaved in the expected way, and every day that passed brought them closer to a coastline that spoke their language and knew their names. They paused at Sierra Leone, on the West African coast, to take on fresh water and provisions. The ship's stores were running critically low, reduced to a diet so meager that some accounts suggest the crew were subsisting largely on the penguins they had taken aboard much earlier in the voyage, preserved and long since exhausted, and whatever fish could be caught. Fresh food, fresh water, the sensation of solid land underfoot. These things, after the accumulated months at sea, would have registered with a physical intensity that is almost impossible to convey to someone who has never been genuinely deprived of them. And then, north, past the familiar latitudes of the trade winds, into the grey and variable weather of the North Atlantic, the weather that English sailors knew as home weather, because it was, the kind of sky that promises rain and usually delivers it. The kind of sea that has opinions about where you are going and expresses them without restraint. On the 26th of September 1580, the Golden Hind entered Plymouth Sound. She had been gone 2 years, 9 months, and some days. She had sailed approximately 36,000 miles. Some estimates run higher, to 40,000 or beyond, depending on the route calculations used. She had begun the voyage as one of 5 ships, and returned as the only one. She had passed through the Strait of Magellan, crossed the Pacific, visited the Spice Islands, circumnavigated the globe, and come home carrying a cargo of Spanish silver and spice, whose value has been estimated at the equivalent of half the annual revenue of the English crown. Drake brought her in on the evening tide, and when the anchor finally went down and held, that definitive sound, the chain running out, and then the sudden cessation of movement that means the ground has caught, he asked his question about the Queen. Elizabeth was alive. England was as he had left it. The world, however, would not be quite the same. The Golden Hind had changed it, quietly, deliberately, across 3 years and the full circumference of the earth. She had changed it, had demonstrated that the oceans were not divided by ownership, that the Pacific was not a Spanish preserve, that a small, well-found English ship with a competent captain and a determined crew could go anywhere the water went. And the water, as it turns out, goes everywhere. There is a moment in the life of certain extraordinary things when they cross a threshold, when they cease to be merely what they are and begin to be what they mean. The transition is rarely announced. It happens quietly, in the space between one perception and the next, and by the time anyone notices it has occurred, it is already complete and irreversible. For the Golden Hind, that moment came on the 4th of April, 1581, on the Thames at Deptford, on a bright spring day that England had decided, with characteristic unpredictability, to make unseasonably warm. Queen Elizabeth I came aboard the ship in the late morning, accompanied by the French ambassador Marshal and a retinue of courtiers whose collective finery must have presented a remarkable contrast to the salt-bleached, travel-worn vessel beneath their feet. The Golden Hind had been brought upriver from Plymouth and moored at Deptford. A naval dockyard south of London, familiar with ships but unaccustomed to quite this quality of attention. And she had been cleaned and dressed for the occasion with whatever ceremony the occasion demanded. The treasure she had carried was already secured, already counted, already the subject of the intense and complicated financial negotiations that attend the arrival of very large quantities of Spanish silver into a country that is technically at peace with Spain. The Queen walked her decks. She inspected her in the way that monarchs inspect things, which is to say, with a quality of attention that is simultaneously entirely genuine and entirely performed, because a monarch is always conscious of being watching. She spoke with Drake. By all accounts, she seemed genuinely delighted, though genuine delight and political theatre were in Elizabeth's hands, instruments so finely tuned that distinguishing between them was a task that defeated most contemporary observers and has continued to defeat historians ever since. Then she produced a sword. The knighting of Francis Drake on the deck of the Golden Hind was a political act of considerable sophistication. By honoring Drake publicly and formally, Elizabeth simultaneously claimed the achievements of the voyage as English achievements, national triumphs, crown-sanctioned and crown-celebrated, and insulated herself from any diplomatic complaint the Spanish might raise by the simple expedient of having already committed. The Spanish ambassador had, in the weeks before the ceremony, formally protested Drake's activities and demanded the return of the plundered treasure. Elizabeth's response, characteristically, was to knight the man who had plundered it. The message was clear, even if the language in which it was delivered was impeccably diplomatic. Drake knelt. The sword touched his shoulder. He rose as Sir Francis Drake, and the Golden Hind, on whose deck this ceremony had been performed, became something more than a ship. She became a monument. She became the physical embodiment of an achievement that England was already, with the particular enthusiasm that nations bring to their own heroic narratives, beginning to mythologize. Elizabeth ordered her preserved. This was an unusual decision. Ships of the era were working tools, and working tools that wore out were replaced, not memorialized. The ordinary fate of a vessel that had completed her useful service was to be broken up, her timber and fittings salvaged for whatever secondary purposes they could serve. Her identity dissolved back into the anonymous materials from which she had been assembled. The decision to preserve the Golden Hind, to keep her intact, moored at Deptford as a permanent monument to Drake's circumnavigation, had no real precedent in English naval history. It was, in its way, the Elizabethan equivalent of putting a spacecraft in a museum. The ship was hauled out and placed in a specially constructed dry dock at Deptford, and for a period of years she became, quite genuinely, a tourist attraction. Visitors came to see her. Accounts from the period describe people walking her decks, running their hands along her rails, standing in the spaces where Drake and his crew had stood. John Stowe, the Elizabethan chronicler, mentions her. She appears in the accounts of foreign visitors to London as one of the sights of the city. She was, for a time, the most famous ship in England, which was a country that took its ships seriously, and always had. A chair was made from her timber during this period of preservation, or so the story goes, and presented to the University of Oxford, where it remains to this day, a relic of a relic, the wood of the ship compressed into an object of ceremonial dignity that dons sit in during certain formal occasions, carrying the weight of 4 centuries and one extraordinary voyage without, presumably, being fully aware of it in any given moment. The poet Abraham Cowley wrote verses about the chair. It generated its own small literary tradition, which is perhaps the strangest possible afterlife for a plank of ship's timber. But preservation, in the 16th century, was an aspiration more than a technology. The tools and understanding required to maintain a wooden ship in genuinely stable condition over decades simply did not exist in the form that would have been required. The Golden Hind sat in her dry dock, and she aged, as wood ages when the conditions of its maintenance are imperfect. Slowly, then less slowly, the fibers breaking down, the joints opening, the accumulated damage of 36,000 miles of ocean making its presence felt in ways that no amount of ceremonial attention could arrest. By the early 1600s, the accounts become vague here, as accounts of endings often do, as though history loses interest precisely at the moment of dissolution. She was in poor condition. By some reports, she was already, in practical terms, a ruin. Her planking sprung, her frames weakened, her structural integrity reduced to the point where what remained was less a ship than the memory of one, held together by habit and reputation rather than sound timber. The exact date of her final breaking up is not recorded with precision. She disappears from the historical record gradually, the references becoming less frequent and less detailed, and then she is simply gone, replaced in the physical world by the absence that all things eventually become. What remained was the legend, and the legend, it turned out, was considerably more durable than the timber. Drake himself survived the circumnavigation by 17 years, and they were years of continued prominence and continued controversy. He served as mayor of Plymouth. He sat in Parliament. He played a central role in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, that great defining moment of Elizabethan England, when the invasion fleet that Philip II of Spain had assembled with such enormous effort and expense was met in the English Channel and driven north into the storms of Scotland and Ireland, where it was destroyed not by English guns, but by English weather. Drake's role in that campaign has been variously assessed. He was Vice Admiral of the English fleet, and his seamanship and tactical instincts contributed materially to what happened. The famous story of his insisting on finishing a game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe before going out to meet the Armada is almost certainly apocryphal, which has not prevented it from becoming one of the most enduring images in English historical mythology. It captures something true about the man even if the specific detail is invented. That quality of deliberate, unhurried confidence in the face of threat that had characterized everything he did from Plymouth to Ternate and back. He died at sea in January of 1596, off the coast of Panama, not far, in the grand geography of his life, from the places where he had first made his reputation as a raider of Spanish possessions nearly 30 years before. He died of dysentery, in the grip of a fever, aboard a ship anchored in Portobello Harbor, and was buried at sea in a lead coffin that still lies somewhere in those warm Caribbean waters. He was in his mid-50s probably. He had spent the majority of his life on the ocean. It was, in a sense, the only appropriate place to leave him. The Golden Hind outlived him in reputation, if not in timber. She passed into the cultural bloodstream of England and, eventually, of the wider English-speaking world, in the way that ships of legendary voyages tend to do. Not as historical artifacts, precisely, but as symbols of what it had meant, in a particular moment of history, to sail beyond the edge of the known world and come back. Symbols of English maritime ambition, English audacity, English willingness to challenge the established order of who owned what ocean and why. Replicas of the Golden Hind have been built in the centuries since, the most prominent of which, constructed in the 1970s and originally intended for the American bicentennial celebrations, now sits moored at Bankside in London, not far from where the original was preserved at Deptford, a geographical proximity that feels appropriate. This replica has been sailed. It has crossed the Atlantic. It has been used as a floating museum and educational vessel, and the people who have crewed and maintained it have reported what historical accounts suggest. Drake's crew experienced that the ship, even in replica, is a remarkable piece of naval architecture, more capable and more seaworthy than her modest dimensions initially suggest. Demanding but responsive, the kind of vessel that rewards skill and attention and punishes neither unfairly. Sailing her, even in replica, Even in the 21st century, with modern safety equipment and modern navigational tools, gives an experiential understanding of what the original voyage required that no amount of historical reading quite delivers. The way the ship moves in a beam sea, the way the wind sounds in the rigging at night, the smallness of the space in which the crew must live, the intimacy of it, and the claustrophobia of it, and the occasional unexpected beauty of it. A sunrise seen from a deck that has been your entire world for weeks. The horizon clean and absolute. The light coming up over the water in the way that light over open water has always come up, indifferent to history and utterly quietly magnificent. Drake sailed that sunrise. His crew saw it night after night, morning after morning, across 3 years and the full circumference of the earth. They were not literary men, most of them. They left few records of what they saw and felt. But the voyage itself is the record, the bare, extraordinary fact of it, the thing they actually did with a small wooden ship, and the accumulated courage and competence of everyone aboard. The Golden Hind is gone. The timber has long since returned to the earth that grew it. The lead coffin carrying its occupant rests in warm Caribbean water, undisturbed and probably undiscoverable. The chair at Oxford holds its stories without telling them. The replica moves on the Thames with the tide, patient and present, a translation of something that cannot be fully translated, a gesture toward a reality that exists now only in documents and imagination, and the deep, continuous human need to know that such things were possible. They were possible. That is what the Golden Hind, in the end, means. That a small ship and a determined crew could go anywhere the water went, and the water went everywhere, and that somewhere beyond every known horizon there was not emptiness but only more world, more light, more ocean, more morning. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Step back for a moment from the details, from the rigging specifications and the gun counts and the tonnage estimates, from the political machinations of the Elizabethan court and the precise coordinates of the Strait of Magellan, from the names of captured ships and the weight of plundered silver, and the exact chronology of a voyage that has been debated and reconstructed and annotated by historians for 4.5 centuries. Step back from all of it and let the larger shape of the thing come into focus, the way you might step back from a painting to see not the individual brushstrokes, but the image they compose together. What you see from that distance is a small wooden ship on a very large ocean. That is the essential image. Everything else, the geopolitics, the economics, the naval architecture, the biography of the man who commanded her, everything else is context for that central, irreducible fact. A small wooden ship on a very large ocean, and the men inside her choosing, every single day, to continue. There is something about that choice, the daily, undramatic, uncelebrated choice to keep going when the rational assessment of one's situation might argue persuasively for stopping. That speaks to something fundamental in human experience. We tend, when we tell stories of great voyages, to focus on the moments of crisis, the storms, the mutinies, the groundings on coral reefs in the dark. These are the moments that lend themselves to narrative, that have the shape of story built into them. A problem, a response, a resolution. But the majority of those 36,000 miles was not crisis. The majority of it was the unremarkable, unrecorded daily work of keeping a ship moving in the right direction through conditions that ranged from tedious to uncomfortable to merely demanding, performed by men who were tired and probably frequently unwell and a long way from anything they had ever known before. That is the part of the story that the historical record, by its nature, cannot fully capture. The ordinary days, the days when nothing happened except that the ship moved forward and the sun crossed the sky, and the watch changed, and the cook produced something from the remaining stores, and the stars came out. and someone, perhaps, sat on the deck in the dark and looked at them. The Pacific stars, seen from a latitude that no Englishman had previously occupied, arranged in patterns that no English tradition had named. What did that feel like? What went through the mind of a Devon fisherman's son, sitting on the deck of a small ship in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, looking up at a sky full of unfamiliar light? We do not know. He did not write it down, or if he did, it has not survived. The historical record gives us facts and figures and occasionally vivid accounts of dramatic events, but it is largely silent on the interior lives of ordinary sailors, on what they thought and felt and dreamed in the long, anonymous middle of a voyage that was, by any reasonable measure, the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to them. Perhaps that silence is itself instructive. Perhaps it suggests that the interior experience of an extraordinary voyage is, at some level, not so different from the interior experience of an ordinary life, full of the same small concerns, the same physical discomforts, the same drifting thoughts, the same moments of unexpected beauty and unexpected tedium. The ocean does not make men into different beings. It simply removes the usual distractions and leaves them more nakedly themselves, which is, when one thinks about it, perhaps the most honest condition available to any person in any era. Francis Drake understood the ocean in this way, not as a stage for heroism, though heroism is certainly what he performed upon it, but as a condition of existence, a medium through which life was conducted, rather than a backdrop against which it was displayed. He had been a seafaring man since boyhood. The ocean was not exotic to him. It was simply where he lived, in the deepest sense of the word. The environment that had shaped his judgment, calibrated his instincts, and taught him everything that he most reliably knew. When he sailed the Golden Hind out of Plymouth Sound in December of 1577, he was not leaving his world behind. In a very real sense, he was entering it. And the ship, the Golden Hind herself, was the instrument through which that entry was made possible. It is worth sitting with the relationship between a captain and a ship for a moment, because it is a relationship that does not have a precise modern equivalent. A ship is not a tool in the way that a hammer is a tool, something passive and inert, activated entirely by the skill of the hand that holds it. A ship is a system, a complex, dynamic, continuously responsive system that has its own characteristics, its own preferences, its own ways of behaving under different conditions, that an experienced captain learns as he learns the habits of a person he knows well. The Golden Hind had things she did well and things she did less well. She was fast by the standards of her type. She was seaworthy in heavy weather. She was maneuverable in ways that a larger vessel could not be. She was also, being small, wet, shipping water over her bow in head seas in a way that larger ships with more freeboard did not. And she was, being laden with silver, slow and heavy, in a way that Drake compensated for by the management of sail and ballast rather than by the simple expedient of lightening her load. He knew her. He sailed her accordingly. The circumnavigation was not achieved by Drake alone, and it was not achieved by the ship alone. It was achieved by the combination, by a man and a vessel that had, across 3 years of continuous intimacy, become something that functioned as a single entity. This is, perhaps, one of the things that sailing has always offered, that other forms of travel have not. The possibility of that particular relationship between a person and a vessel, in which the boundaries between instrument and operator become productively unclear. The sailors who love the sea most deeply tend to speak of their boats the way they speak of people, with affection, with exasperation, with respect, with the kind of detailed knowledge that only comes from sustained and serious attention. Drake, who was not a sentimental man in most respects, renamed his ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He chose a name that honored his patron, yes, But he also gave the ship a new identity at the moment when the voyage had become something qualitatively different from what it had started out as. When it had passed through the strait and survived the storms and become, irreversibly, a circumnavigation, the renaming was an acknowledgement that the ship had earned something. A new name felt appropriate. She had become, by that point, something that the Pelican had not been when she left Plymouth. She had become legendary. Even before she came home, the centuries that have followed her return have treated the Golden Hind with the particular combination of reverence and creative liberty that attaches to genuine legends. She has appeared in paintings and poems, in novels and plays and films, in the names of public houses and naval vessels and suburban streets. Every few generations, a new replica is built. The urge to reconstruct her seems to recur with the regularity of a tide, as though each era needs to demonstrate for itself that the thing was actually possible, that the dimensions were actually real, that a ship that small could actually have done what the historical record claims she did. And each time a replica is sailed seriously, the verdict is the same. She could. She was small, and she was demanding, and she required everything her crew had to offer. But she was capable. She was, within the considerable constraints of what wood and rope and canvas can be persuaded to accomplish, remarkable. There is a particular kind of immortality that belongs to ships of legend, different from the immortality of great buildings which impose themselves on the landscape and demand acknowledgement, or the immortality of great texts which survive in the precision of their language and can be returned to exactly. The immortality of a ship is more fragile and more intimate than either. It lives in the imagination rather than in stone or paper. It is sustained not by the object itself, which, as we have seen, has long since ceased to exist in any physical form, but by the continuous human act of picturing her, of conjuring her from the available evidence, and setting her moving again across the reconstructed ocean of a reconstructed past. Every person who has ever looked at an image of the Golden Hind and tried to imagine what it was actually like, the smell of the bilges, the sound of the rigging at night, the particular quality of light on the water of Tierra del Fuego, or the Moluccas, or the California coast, has participated in that act of sustaining, has kept the ship alive in the only way that ships of her age can now be kept alive, which is in the imagination, which is itself a kind of ocean, deep and changeable and full of things that resist easy mapping. She has been moving through that ocean for 4.5 centuries. She shows no sign of stopping, and perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion available for the story of a vessel whose entire life was defined by forward motion, by the daily, determined, unhurried choice to keep going, to keep the bow pointed toward the horizon, to sail into whatever the next stretch of water held with the calm, competent confidence of a ship and a crew that had decided, collectively, that the ocean was not an obstacle, but an invitation. The Golden Hind accepted that invitation completely. She sailed the width of the world. She came home changed, and she changed the world she came home to. She sat on the Thames and let a queen walk her decks and let a sword be raised above them. She aged, and she decayed, and she returned to the materials she had come from, the way all things eventually do, and the water she sailed. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the waters of the Strait and the waters of the Cape, continues as it has always continued, indifferent to history, indifferent to the names we give to the things that cross it, moving in its own time, by its own mathematics, under its own stars. The water does not remember the Golden Hind the way we remember her. The water does not remember anything. It simply continues, patient, enormous, and ancient, in a way that makes the whole of human ambition seem, from certain angles, very small and very brief and very dear. But we remember.